Chapter 8 Russia's Challenge to America's Faith. In my attempt to learn about religion in Russia, I discovered a challenge, not a threat, to religion all over the world, and more particularly to religion in America. The challenge is that we must live our faith as never before, define it to a degree never before thought necessary, and examine it anew in the light of honesty and truth. For whether we asked for it or not, we have the reputation of being the most religious nation on earth. Perhaps we have asked for it. We have published high-powered statistics about our spiritual strength as measured in church-building programs, church membership, church finances. We have organized a campaign to erect a string of churches along the edge of the Iron Curtain, so that we might impress the Russians with the need for our type of religious faith. We have said that since Russia is godless, its people must be evil, and Christian churchmen have voiced the threat that God, in his wrath, will ultimately destroy the Soviet state. Our reputation for being the most religious nation on earth is part of the price we have paid for sending evangelists and missionaries around the world to proselytize and convert, and for sending teams of clergymen to the USSR to appraise the worth of Russian faith. We are foremost among those carrying out the Great Commission to teach all nations. Matt 28:19. Some Russians consider even our aid to foreign countries a token of our feeling of religious superiority. They say we are priding ourselves about our religion every time we testify to the great things God has done for us. Good men should not boast about their goodness, they said to me, nor should anyone stand up in public and preach that his way of life is the one and only way. Christ may have given the keys of heaven and hell to the Roman Catholic Church, but Russians do not believe it. God may have imparted a pacific plan of salvation to the Protestants, but the self-termed atheists are skeptical. America may be the home of those whom God has chosen for special favors, but the Reds are out to challenge the claim. We are dealing with a type of mind, the Marxist mind, which demands objective practice as the criterion of truth, asks us to make good on what we proclaim, and to carry out the principles we volubly profess. Actually, this kind of thinking may be a good thing for us. We may need to be awakened spiritually as we were rudely awakened scientifically when the first Russian satellites cut their orbits across the sky. My first impulse, when Russians insinuated that we boasted about our religion, was to ask whether communism was not also a boast. I started to say that if they are out to communize the world, why should they blame us for wishing to Christianize it? Don't they assume superiority every time they call attention to the advantages of their system and the glory of their work? Isn't it as much or more a boast for them to deny God as it is for us to declare Him? Is it not a presumptuous for them to contend that man's social existence determines his consciousness, as it is for us to argue that man's consciousness determines his existence. I quickly realized that a defensive attitude leads nowhere. We could go on forever insisting that we are right and they are wrong, and they no doubt would be willing to stay with us insisting that we are wrong and they are right, rather than continuing to defend our position or to condemn theirs. I decided to stay as close as possible to the pursuit of my original question, the question that had lured me to Russia. Can the religious impulse be sublimated into that which is not religious? I came to Russia, as I have said, with the oft-tested belief that wherever man lives, man worships. I believed with all my heart that man is by nature spiritual. But in Russia, life is lived in the pattern of mass movement. The Kremlin wants us to believe that the idea of an individual embarking on a personal spiritual quest is inconceivable. Such a spectacle, that of a man seeking God, is in itself a form of private enterprise and should be discouraged. I could say that the communists affirmed the existence of God by their denial of him, falling back upon the old argument that we need not deny that which does not exist. But communism insists that we must deny even the illusion of God. God, they ruthlessly contend, is a fabrication, a lie, along with other such lies as Satan and Saint Nick. Over and over, I had to remind myself that to the Marxist, all reality is material. Truth to him is identified with matter. Mind is matter. Principle, honesty, conduct are all based on matter. To be a Marxist is to discover and acknowledge truth only through sense perception, never by way of spiritual insight. But having said all that, what conclusions had I actually reached? What answers had I found in this laboratory of unbelief? A few things could be said with certainty. Russians cannot be lumped together as though they are all integral parts of a communist bloc. Not all communists are confirmed atheists, nor are all atheists malevolent. This is important in its direct bearing upon an American psychosis, which has identified non-church members, even in America, with atheism, and therefore with communism. The 70 million Americans whose names do not appear on church rolls are sometimes adjudged irreligious because of it. They should not be so judged. Their lack of interest in institutionalized religion should not be construed as a sign of spiritual unbelief, nor should unbelief be considered analogous to communism. An unbeliever anywhere in the world need not necessarily be a communist, but in Russia, the majority of the 7 million card-carrying communists are affirmed atheists. No church member holds either a responsible government position or one of economic leadership, and no true communist is a church member. All subscribe to an anti-God, anti-Christ policy, and yet what these millions actually believe about God is anyone's guess. A full-fledged communist said to me, "What I believe about religion is my business. Maybe I believe in God, and maybe I do not. The only thing the party wants to know is whether or not I belong to a church. I do not belong to a church, but what I believe and think about religion belongs to me." When I asked another what he would consider the ideal church, if churches there must be, he said, "a place where people gather to sing together and to pray separately. Communism clearly states that religion is a private matter until it takes the form of an organization or of an institution. Then it becomes a public concern. Organization implies a clash of loyalties. The Bolsheviks insisted that the workers needed protection against the intrigue and exploitation of the church, no less than against the oppression of the landowning and capitalistic classes. The party was heralded as a united front against economic injustice and religious deception. Lenin said, "The class-conscious worker of today leaves heaven to the priest and Burgess hypocrites. He fights for a better life for himself here on earth." Lenin, president of the Soviets from 1917 to 1924, had no such slogans as "Down with religion" or "Long live atheism." He was too clever for that. He declared that the planned propagation of atheism is injurious to the class struggle. The anarchist who preaches against God at all cost, he told his followers, actually helps the priest and the burgess. The Marxist must be a dialectical materialist, one who fights against religion not by abstract, purely theoretical propaganda, but concretely on the basis of class struggle, a struggle which will educate the masses better than anything else can do. This is the current communist approach, compared with the closing of churches, persecution of ministers, and execution of priests in the post-revolution years. The present state of religion in Russia is one of relative freedom and peace. It is not freedom as we know it in the United States. While there is official separation of church and state, and though non-communist may freely belong to a church, there are still severe restrictions on the propagation and function of religion in the USSR. Evangelistic crusades, young people's meetings, laymen's movements, Sunday schools, and parochial schools are generally forbidden. Freedom of worship is confined to the privilege of attending church services and choir rehearsals. Several priests and ministers told me they believe that more restriction will be lifted and the situation will continue to improve. They felt that as Russia's prestige and power grow abroad, more and more concessions will be made at home. Though the Kremlin leaders may appear ruthless and despotic, they have, as I was told by the teacher in Stalingrad, a listening ear directed toward public opinion and world reaction. The Kremlin leaders want Russia to be the world's #1 nation. Everything from agriculture to missiles is in contest, and the power of religion, or lack of it, is a major issue in which the winning of the world opinion is part of the prize. They are wise enough to know that if they can win the minds of men through impressive scientific achievements, they may win the souls of men by a gradual transition from atheistic communism to agnostic communism. This is part of their challenge. Challenging, too, were the question of young Russians when they asked, "In what way does religion make Americans different from us? Don't most Americans feel that by professing morality, they are practicing morality?" Are Americans who attend church higher principled than those who do not attend? Questions like these are in the minds of Russian students, 90% of whom have never been inside a church, but most of whom are seriously and realistically concerned about basic values in life, They want evidence that what we believe has relevancy in the policies by which we live and act. Young Russia's preconceived notion that religious people cannot be trusted is as deep-seated as our contention that godless people cannot be good. They have been systematically schooled regarding the sins of which organized religion has, unfortunately, often been guilty. They have not been told about religion's blessings, its help to humanity, or its solace to individual lives. They are startlingly uninformed about the contributions of contemporary faith to humanity. Most of the young people with whom I talked had never heard of a man called Albert Schweitzer. By our crime statistics, our juvenile delinquency, our secularism, and our capitalistic imperialism, they judge that religion in the USA is impotent. They sincerely believe that communism is less guilty of the sins of racism, immorality, and exploitation than is Christianity. Much of our spiritual force is lost because it is contradicted by our actions. Communism may never be construed as a religion by the Soviets, but as a way of life it will continue to be defined more and more. It is not at all inconceivable that God, as a prime mover in the universe, may one day be defined as a primary spiritual principle by the Russian proletariat. There is already a growing insistence in communism that materialistic philosophy is rich in the ethical and moral qualities which religion, particularly Christianity, holds as basic. This may seem contradictory to us, but the fact remains that communism is challenging those of us who may have doubted that it is impossible to be good without God. Despite an enforced atheism, or perhaps because of it, there is a growing awareness among young Russians that they must demonstrate to the world that a man can be righteous without religion. They will still have to prove that this is possible in the long run, but outspoken humanists contend they are proving it. I heard frequent reference to benevolent Marxists, altruistic freethinkers, beneficent socialists. The popularity of such phrases is being bolstered by the prevailing propaganda that Christianity is divisive, selfish, exploitive. A priest of the Russian Orthodox faith said to me, "We, Russia, may yet have to teach the Western religious world how to work together. We have more cooperation among faiths here than you have in the United States. We Americans know what our heritage of religious freedom means to us, and what it implies. We know the price at which this heritage was purchased. We know the liberty our faith gives us, the personal dignity it inspires, the responsibility it enjoins, and the goals unrealized and unattained that it sets before us. We know the vision of the kingdom of God it presents to us. But Russia evaluates our religiosity by none of these. It sees us only as a nation and judges us on the basis of our social and political conduct, our policies, methods, and aims in the struggle for world domination. Regardless of how you and I feel about it, Russia is convinced that the spiritual voice of America in international affairs is less than a whisper. Money talks, military power talks, prestige talks, but religion has not been able to get in a word, even edgewise. Russia believes there is no united prophetic voice in America, no religious cutting edge, no men of courage who stand for God without thought of personal gain or thought of fame. One Russian grimly referred to our religion as that of the full stomach of the Cadillac car. This too is part of the challenge. Many Americans have dreamed of some dramatic move which would utilize and reflect the faith that earnest Christians hold. But so far it has not been possible to transmit this into a national policy or translate it into action. Some Americans, especially those belonging to our country's traditional peace groups, have been urging a halt to the arms race for some time. They are being joined by a growing witness on the part of the church, and the voices of religious leaders are beginning to be heard on the problems and issues of war and peace. Churchmen are coming to realize that it is high time for courageous action in the name of the Christian faith. Russia is challenging us to define how far we are willing to go in our trust in God. We are bluntly being asked how realistic we can be in living out what our religion proclaims. We are even faced with the necessity of reappraising our values. Many a young Russian said to me, "I do not miss the things you Americans think you must have to live happily. I have a goal to work for, and this means more to me than an easy life." Such a statement may of course be mere juvenile idealism, yet it is idealism and expresses at least one bent of the Russian student mind. It is unrealistic for us not to consider the implications here involved. On the Christmas following the launching of the Russian satellite, a cartoon appeared in American papers. It showed a burly communist confronting a young American boy who was pulling a Christmas sled. The communist was saying, "Look, we have Sputnik," to which the boy replied, "But no Saint Nick." The meaning is clear. No country in the world has the sense of concern, the wish to help and share, which we Americans have. We see clearly the inherent fallacy of communist thought. We know that the laws which communism's leaders do not believe in need not be obeyed by them. We believe we have a law higher than the law of the commune or the law of a liberal conscience, and we recognize that this higher law is God. The law is there, though we often fall short of attaining it. This striving toward oneness with God, this belief in the possible realization of the fulfillment of man's deepest quest, is our greatest national heritage. We believe that we are able to be better and nobler people than we are, and that in order to achieve these qualities, we must be free. Communism has not been able to satisfy the human desire for freedom and the quest of the spirit, and anyone who meets the Russian people with sympathy and understanding will realize this fact. My Russian journey convinced me that the yearning for God, which I had found in other parts of the world, is no less real among the Soviet people. It cannot be sublimated into something which is not spiritual. Accompanying communistic scientific progress is a growing sense of spiritual loss and spiritual maladjustment. The individual in the Russian proletariat seeks to discover and complete and transcend himself in someone and something higher and greater than nationalism, or the goal of a classless world. Neither economic determinism nor dialectical materialism has been able to satisfy man's awareness that life is related to an unseen eternal force. The source of this quest is in the very nature of man, and obviously it is found in Russians as in everyone else. Any doubt I might have had about this was dispelled on my final Sunday in Moscow, for it was my privilege that morning to speak from the pulpit of the Moscow Baptist Church, the fastest growing church in the world. Arrangements for my participation in the service were made when I dropped in, unannounced and alone, at the church office on Malivazovsky Lane. The moment I got inside the doors, I realized I was in the heart of a going concern. Secretaries were busily at work, telephones were ringing, and an American, Kirby Page, was talking to an interpreter about a group that he had brought on tour from the States. I was cordially greeted by two chief pastors of this church, who came from behind their cramped and crowded desks to shake my hand. The alert and scholarly Pastor Karov spoke German. The venerable bearded pastor Zidkov seemed to understand all languages as well as the language of the Spirit, but he spoke only Russian. I found these men easy to meet, hospitable, and eager to be friendly, though Pastor Karev made it clear early in our meeting that he could not for the life of him understand why American churches refused to cooperate in the World Council of Peace. My research in religion interested these men very much. They felt that Russia was conducting a successful experiment in interreligious relations. They saw in Russian religion some of the qualities of the early apostolic church. They realized the need for witnessing. They had no criticism of the Kremlin, no remorse about the challenge that confronted the church in Russia, no complaint about anything except that they wished America would trust Russia more, and by Russia they meant the people like themselves, and like the 600,000 members who make up the evangelical Baptist churches of the Soviet Union. By America they meant the people and the government, because we claim that our government is by and for the people. That is why more is expected of us. Christians must cooperate with other Christians, regardless of racial or cultural differences. Pastor Karov said, Russian Christians, he said, are willing to do it, and most Baptists are willing. The Baptist World Alliance, I was told, has 21 million members in 100 countries, speaking 100 different languages and dialects, and among Baptists there are none more deeply committed than the Russian Evangelical Baptist. I was assured I would meet many of them on Sunday morning. How many? Well, the church could accommodate about 900, but at least 1,400 would somehow crowd into the service. This would be the 10:30 service, and I was advised that throughout Sunday, every Sunday, 5 services are held, each crowded to the doors with 1,400 or more worshippers. Would Lorena be permitted to take pictures? Of course. Could she be given a vantage point in the balcony? Why not? An American suggested he wanted to put my remarks on tape recording. Would that be allowed? Surely. The only concern in any of these details was that the spirit of worship should not be impaired. Outside of that, freedom was unlimited. I did not think of myself as a preacher, so I did not plan to deliver a sermon, but what I wanted more than anything else was to bring greetings from America and tell Russians about religion's role in American life. Would that be permissible? The pastors gave me carte blanche to say whatever I wished. I was pleased at this because churchmen back home had told me all sorts of weird stories about enforced restrictions. One man I recalled insisted that all remarks had to be put down in writing and submitted to the church officials before presentation to the public. This may have been true during the Stalin regime, but it was not true in my experience. I was not told what to say or what not to say. I decided to write out nothing, but to speak extemporaneously, as the Spirit moved me. Before I came to Russia, I had heard some stirring things about this Moscow Baptist church. A year ago, an industrialist friend of mine, Vern L. Ch8, attended an evening service here. He was surprised when several enthusiastically scrawled notes fluttered down from the balcony overhead. Knowing of my interests in religion, he brought the notes home to me. Written on shreds of white paper in laborious English, they said, "You are quite welcome, dear guest. Remember our kind regards to your brothers and sisters in the USA. We wish you well. God be with you." The history of the Baptist faith in Russia goes back nearly 100 years. It began with Martin Ch8, a Lutheran, who during a visit to Germany was greatly impressed with the life and teachings of the German Baptists. Convinced of the validity of adult baptism and inspired by the exemplary life of the people he met, he asked to be rebaptized, joined the church, and returned to Russia to propagate the faith. In those days, it was against the law to proselytize from the fold of Russian Orthodoxy, but Ch8's fervor, in keeping with good Baptist doctrine, knew no law but love, no book but the Bible, no creed but Christ. The first convert was a Transcaucasian merchant, Nikita Voronin. Ch8 baptized him in a river and anointed him with his zeal. With the help of Baptists in England, Canada, and America, despised and persecuted by orthodoxy, the work grew until today. As part of the Baptist World Alliance, it claims 5,000 churches in the USSR and is growing. I saw how it was growing when Lorena and I came to the services on Sunday morning. At 10 o'clock, the crowds in front of the church blocked our taxi. At 10:15, I had the feeling that it was a Christmas or an Easter service. We were told there would not be 1,400 but 1,600 this morning, not because an American was speaking, but simply because Christ is enthusiastically worshipped at Malivasovsky Lane. Several young men helped us through the throngs into the church office. And tourist was right. One of the guides had told me, "You will find worshippers there all right." They were everywhere, old people, young people, well-dressed, and poorly dressed people. People were even trying patiently to find places in the hallways, though they would be unable to see the chancel from those positions. Lorena required the aid of 2 men to reach her assigned place in the balcony. I caught a glimpse of her later, and how she was able to manipulate her cameras in that crowd I will never know. The balcony, which runs in a semicircle around the auditorium, was filled to dangerous proportions, far beyond its capacity. Stairways were packed. Pews had evidently been occupied immediately after the close of the previous service. People are urged to attend only one service, so as to make room for other worshippers for the services that follow. The aisles were jammed in a way that would have shocked any safety-minded American. The hundreds waiting on the street would never get in for this session. From the church chancel, where the pastors and I had arrived, by many an Isvanite, pardon me, I could see the 100-voice choir gathering in the center loft of the balcony. Clarence Westphal, the American who planned to record the singing and my remarks, managed to join us in the chancel. Also present were a woman interpreter, appointed by Dr. Karov, and 3 scholarly young Russians studying for the Baptist ministry. An organ prelude opened the service, and a wave of devotion moved through the congregation. The sea of shawled heads bowed low. Men who stood among the throngs of elderly women lifted their heads proudly. Young people, perhaps 200, as nearly as I could estimate their number, became uncommonly reverent. I recalled what a Russian student told me. "It is wrong," he said, "ever to compare Russian young people with the Hitler Youth, as some people like to do. We have not been indoctrinated with the idea of a super race. We are not the victims of hate campaigns. We have not been trained for war. We are trained for peace. We are being taught to be good." These young people, most of them in their early 20s, looked good. Evidently, worship meant something to them. Many closed their eyes in prayer during the organ prelude. I have been in Christian churches in many places, and have often been moved by people's devotion, but for one brief, electrifying moment, I felt a thrill here unlike any I could recall. I was caught for a moment in the thought that worship is more precious where it is not free. A Christian in Russia is God's witness by the very fact of being a Christian. It means something to declare for Christ here under a godless government. At least it means that a man is willing to stand up and be counted. I was glad I was not asked to speak after the first stirring hymn, or following the first pastoral prayer. Though the words were foreign to me, their spirit communicated to me the heart of faith, which is always expressed in sincerity, and can be felt always as a thing experienced. Religion's most rabid critic, and Russia's most severe censor would, I feel sure, have stood in awe at the majesty of the singing, and the sincerity of the ministers who opened this service with prayer. Had I been asked to speak just then, I would have been tempted to say that God still walks the Russian streets, still lives in peasants' hearts, still haunts the churches, and still speaks to Russian youth. I would have said, "He will emerge again in Russia. He will be made known again. He will be proclaimed again in the rich glory of his presence and the knowledge of his love. It was communion service. The huge loaves of bread and the silver goblets were placed upon the table beneath the pulpit, after the customary scripture readings and the traditional preparation for the Lord's Supper, which consist of soul-searching questions by the pastor and a confession on the part of the congregation. The elements were administered. Slowly and reverently, 12 elders of the church passed the silver platters among the people. On the platters lay the crumbs of bread, which had been blessed by the minister with the familiar words, "This is my body, which is broken for you." Then the wine, sanctified under the well-known words, "This cup is my blood of the new covenant," was poured into the large goblets. These were passed among the believers, returned for refilling, then passed again until the time, long consecrated moments later, when everyone had partaken. The bread and wine were offered for me also, though I had been told that sometimes closed communion is observed and non-members are not served. I accepted the elements with a feeling that took me back to my first Eucharist in our little German church back home, and I stood now, as then, wondering how this sense of oneness with God and with one's fellow men can be made more enduring and more secure. Here, the fundamental force of Russian atheism was being met head-on by the fundamental force of the Christian faith. The spiritually vigorous Baptists were spelling out their belief as courageously as any organized group would dare to do. God was being worshipped through the mystical body of Christ in a country where, as far as the government is concerned, the name of God, if it should ever be written officially, would not even be capitalized. It was in the deep and reverent aftermath of the distribution of the bread and wine that Pastor Karov introduced me to the congregation. He made it clear that I had not come at the request of any particular religious denomination, that I was not a governmental representative, that my primary aim was a personal interest in Russian religion. He was always pleased, he said, when the Christians of America or Christians from anywhere in the world came to Moscow and to the church. Whatever I cared to say from the pulpit would, he felt sure, be appreciated. The young woman, an unusually capable interpreter, stood with me in the pulpit. Quickly and fluently she transmitted to the ministers and to the people my appreciation of the privilege extended to me. I told them, I wish that every American could have the opportunity to stand here in this pulpit. I wish that my fellow Americans could see this scene, the crowded church, and the rows of people standing in the aisles. From here it looks like a living cross. I bring you greetings from America. We feel that better understanding is one of Christianity's great ideals, and the best way we can understand each other is to meet together on a person-to-person basis. World peace is our great challenge and our common goal. I wish to assure you that the people of the United States wish peace very earnestly. They wish to live at peace with all the world. As this was translated for the congregation, many among them shook their heads sorrowfully. Tears came to the eyes of several of the women. They desperately wished to believe that what their speaker was saying was true. They wished to be reassured about America's desire for peace. They wished also to hear of America's selflessness in the aid of charities to which it is committed. They wanted to be told again about America's greatest and goodness, in the hope that I might contradict some of the things they had heard to the contrary. Most of all, they wanted to be convinced that Americans did not hate the Russian people, did not look down upon them, did not really wish to blast them off the face of the earth. I will confess to a bit of sentimentality. I said to them, I seem to see the face of my mother in many of you women. I remember how often my mother brought the bread for the Lord's Supper in my church back home, just as you women brought the loaves this morning. Truly, Christianity has a way of drawing us together into one great fellowship. We follow the same God. We love the same Christ. Perhaps the only true line of communication left in the world is the communication of faith, and it will be a tragic day if ever we lose that. They nodded in understanding. Murmurs of agreement surged along the crowded walls. I could see that my interpreter's words were being relayed from the people in the hallways to the crowds out in the streets. They thought occurred to me that dealing with the Russian people is better than dealing with Russia. We may condemn the leaders, but we can have only a true affection and sympathy for those they lead. I spoke of my research in other religions. I commented on the warmth and understanding and sincere friendliness of this congregation which had come here for the same reason, that people come to church everywhere to satisfy the quest for God, a quest which cannot be sublimated in anything except God. There was a great display of emotion when I said I would carry the memory of this service back to America. People touched their hands to their hearts when I closed with the promise to take their greetings to the churches in my country. They responded with excited and enthusiastic waving of hands and murmurs of "God bless you" and "peace." Then Pastor Karev announced that the congregation and choir would sing a hymn. He said he hoped it would span the continents and linger with me as I continued my travels. I have heard "God be with you till we meet again" sung in many places and in many languages, but never with more sincerity and spirit than here in the Moscow Baptist Church. Tears filled the eyes of many worshippers. I looked over to where Lorena was standing and saw her with her head bowed and eyes closed. For the moment, cameras were forgotten. Just then I had the impression that religion in Russia is considerably more vital, more militant, and more real than I had ever believed it could be. The true force of the Russian soul, questing and unconquered, emerged from this congregation, and I felt the spirit of the millions who have persistently refused to let communism destroy their will to believe. For one brief moment, all that I had seen and heard among the religious people of the Soviet Union blended into a hymn of praise that had something to sing about faith in religion's tomorrow. The door of hope had been opened, and the glory of worship here expressed was a challenge to us who have never had that door forcibly closed. But later, after the singing was stilled, and after the last earnest worshipper had pressed my hand or said his emotional Slava Bogu, I walked again near the Kremlin walls Again, I saw the huge crowds passing through the tomb of Stalin and Lenin. Once more, as I realized that religion is still officially deplored and openly denounced by those who rule and control the people, I felt that God is having no easy time of it, no matter what the signs may say. I remembered what a Russian Roman Catholic said to me. The Master desperately needs help. That is nothing new. That has been his lot in every nation and in every age. But if you were ever disappointed with the evidence of spirituality in Russia, it is because you did not look deeply enough. Faith here is a subterranean stream, and it rises nearer the surface day by day. How true his observation was, and how strong and clear the stream will again flow in Russian life, only time will tell. But while the Soviets' atheistic experiment continues, and while the churches struggle on, all Russia is watching America for evidences of the impact of our spirituality upon our individual and national life. That too is part of the challenge to you and to me as we reappraise our own faith in the light of the Soviets and God.